Chapter 007. Of Gaps and Pretending. At first, Zorian hadn't even noticed him. That was noteworthy by itself, as Zack wasn't an easy person to overlook. The boy loved attention and seemed to have trouble staying still and quiet, something that remained consistent even after Zack suddenly turned into some kind of a weirdo time traveler. Today, however, the normally loud and exuberant boy remained eerily silent. He also eschewed his typical tactic of sitting in the back of the classroom to occupy a seat near the front. If his out-of-character behavior hadn't caused people to glance at him a bit too often, Zorian would have probably overlooked him. He was so shocked to see the boy finally present in class that he momentarily halted in his tracks, standing like an idiot in the middle of the classroom. Then, after a moment's thought, he set off towards the likely cause of his predicament. His first instinct was to immediately march up to the boy and drag him away into some forgotten corner to clear everything up, but Zack's subdued appearance gave him pause. Zack's skin was pale and bloodless, and he was breathing a little too quickly and shallowly for a healthy person. He looked sick. Thinking about it a little more carefully, approaching the boy so directly would be a reckless and possibly dangerous course of action. His loss to the Lich aside, Zack was vastly more powerful than Zorian, and Zorian had no idea how the other boy would react if he knew there was another person tagging along in his time-traveling adventure. He'd need to confront him sooner or later, though, so he fully intended to make at least tentative contact with the boy. He scanned the front of the classroom, looking for a free seat near Zack that would allow him to study the boy during the lecture. He didn't have to look hard. Zack was sitting very close to Briam, and every seat around Briam was empty. The cause was easy to divine. People were reluctant to get close to the angry-looking fire drake he was holding. As someone with future knowledge, Zorian knew their fears were well-founded. While the young fire drake didn't torch anyone, and sometimes Zorian wondered how much of that was thanks to the drake's youth and lack of ability, as opposed to having self-restraint, it didn't hesitate to bite and scratch, and it was hard to tell what would set it off. Fortunately, it seemed to tolerate Zorian better than most people, so he simply plopped down into the seat next to Briam, silencing the lizard's hissing with an annoyed glare. He stared at the fire drake's slitted yellow eyes until the reptile turned its head and left him alone. "Wow, you shut him down in an instant," remarked Briam. "I wish I could control him that easily." The fire drake snapped its jaws at the air in front of Briam's face, causing the boy to flinch back. Briam huffed in annoyance and apparently let the matter drop. Not for the first time, Zorian wondered just how smart that creature really was. Then, doing his best to appear natural, Zorian turned to Zack sitting a bit further away from him. "You look like hell," Zorian remarked. Zack groaned and buried his face into his hands. "I feel like hell," he moaned. "What did that pile of bones do to me?" Zorian's heart quickened. Zack no doubt expected his comment to be disregarded as a weird metaphor, but to Zorian it was definite confirmation that Zack was also a time traveler. No points for guessing who or what the mysterious pile of bones was. Now, how could he get Zack to talk more without revealing that he knew more than he should? "Pile of bones?" Zorian asked, his voice curious. Zack opened his mouth to respond, but Ilsa chose that exact moment to walk into the classroom and Zack dropped the issue. Zorian had to restrain himself from glaring at Ilsa as she smiled at him. Couldn't she have waited a few more minutes? Ignorant and uncaring of Zorian's internal grumbling, Ilsa accepted the list of present students from Akoja and began introducing herself and her class. It wasn't anything that Zorian hadn't heard 8 times already, so he mostly ignored her in favor of keeping an eye on Zack and plotting how to extract time travel-related information out of him. Suddenly he realized that Ilsa had stopped talking and was looking in his direction. After a few moments he realized she was looking at Zack. "Mr. Novita, you look quite ill. Please tell me you didn't come to my class with a hangover." The class erupted into laughter and Zach winced, either because loud noises bothered him in the state he was in or because he noticed the undercurrent of agitation in Ilse's question. Either way he recovered quickly. "It's not a hangover," protested Zach. "I just woke up like this, I swear." "And you thought that coming to class like this was a good idea, why?" Ilse prodded. "I honestly didn't think it would last this long. I figured it would pass in an hour or two," said Zach sheepishly. Zorian frowned. If the sickness was a consequence of the spell the Lich had targeted them with that evening, and Zach certainly seemed to think so, if his previous comment was any indication, that would mean Zach had been suffering its effects for the past 8 months or so, as Zach had been absent for that long. Why would Zach expect a condition that serious to pass in an hour or two? Why couldn't there be any simple answers in all this? "Well, it didn't," Ilse concluded. "While I appreciate your dedication to your studies," Zorian distinctly heard Ako snorting derisively in the background, "I must insist you go home or, better yet, visit a healer. You look like you're going to collapse any moment." Before Zach could say anything, Zorian rose from his seat. "I'll get him home, teacher," he said. Zach gave him a surprised look, but Ilse just nodded and shooed them away. Zorian picked up his bag and left with Zach in tow, very pleased with himself. He got a legitimate excuse to talk to Zach in private and a permission to skip a class he had already attended 8 times by now. Could a victory be more complete? "You didn't have to do that, you know," Zach remarked, trailing behind him. "I can get back home on my own. I don't feel that sick." "But if I hadn't done that, I would have had to sit through 2 hours of boring review," countered Zorian. Zach laughed, but his laughter quickly collapsed into a painful-sounding cough. "Damn," he wheezed. "He really did a number on me." "Who is this someone you keep mentioning?" prodded Zorian. "It's not important," Zach mumbled. He took a deep breath and fixed Zorian with a speculative look. "Hey. Want to go to the cafeteria and grab something to eat? You think your stomach can handle it?" Zorian asked. "You bet," Zach nodded. "I'm starving." Zorian shrugged and gestured for Zach to lead the way. That was how Zorian found himself sharing a table with the cause of his time-traveling problems, trying to think of a good opening for a conversation he wanted to have with the boy. Or should he wait for a few days to make Zach get used to his presence? "You know, I find this whole situation very amusing," Zach said between mouthfuls, shoveling noodles into his mouth and attempting to talk at the same time. Now that was very amusing. His mother always insisted he should aspire to behave like a noble. She would have a heart attack if he ever adopted Zach's eating manners. "A good little student like you, skipping class to have lunch with a class delinquent, what is the world coming to? What would your mother say if she saw you now?" "First of all, I'm not skipping class, I'm escorting you home," Zorian pointed out, ignoring a snort from Zach. "We just stopped for a meal so you wouldn't collapse from starvation before we get there." Another snort. "And my mother would go all sparkly-eyed at who I'm having lunch with and promptly forget I'm supposed to be in class." "A social climber," Zach said, a sour expression on his face. "Say no more. At least you're male so she wouldn't try to pair us." "Well, I do have a 9-year-old sister." "Don't go there," Zach warned. "Fine," agreed Zorian. He didn't particularly want to continue in that avenue, anyway. "So are you going to tell me who roughed you up or what?" "You're a lot nosier than I remember," Zach huffed. "What makes you think someone roughed me up?" "Your offhand comments aren't as oblique as you imagine them to be," Zorian said. "Whatever," Zach scoffed. "I just breathed in some weird fumes while I was messing with my alchemy set yesterday, that all." The trusty, alchemical accident excuse. So cliché, yet so effective. Zorian had used it quite a few times himself. In any case, he wasn't willing to let go so easily. He decided to risk it and try to provoke a reaction from the boy. Must have been some really weird fumes, the after effects almost look like soul magic exposure, Zorian speculated loudly. Zorian had expected some kind of reaction from Zack, but what he got was quite a bit stronger than what he had imagined. Zack immediately sat straighter in his seat, eyes wide in realization. Of course. That's why I'm still suffering the effects, even after the revert. The son of a bitch targeted the very thing that gets sent back, my soul. There was an eerie silence in the cafeteria as everyone stared at the crazy boy shouting nonsense in a crowded dining hall. Zack slowly lowered his hands, he had been gesticulating wildly during his little speech, and mumbled an apology that was too quiet for anyone but Zorian to hear. Scattered laughter rippled through the gathered students for a few moments before everything finally returned to normal. Started Zack. Maybe we should continue this at the fountain.
Yeah.
I don't know, remarked Zorian carefully. If you intend to be this loud, I don't think it will do much. Oh.
Ha! Ha!
Grumbled Zack. So I got a little excited, not everyone is an ice cube like you, Zorian. Ice cube? Asked Zorian, an undercurrent of warning in his voice. But Zack was already packing, and Zorian could do nothing but huff in annoyance and follow after him. Still, Zack's little outburst answered a few of his questions. So it wasn't his memories, or even his mind that got sent back, it was his soul. That would certainly explain why his spellwork and shaping skills didn't disappear every time he started over. It was common knowledge that magic was heavily connected to the soul, even if no one really knew the exact mechanism of their interaction. When they finally reached the fountain, Zack seemed to be in a contemplative mood, so Zorian took a moment to study the schools of colorful fish swimming in the basin of the fountain. He actually pitied the poor things, since they were unlikely to last long. For years the fountain had been in disrepair, and it was only due to the grander-than-usual summer festival that it was renovated. How likely was it that the academy would continue to maintain it after the occasion passed? Not very. And it was even less likely it would be kept in a good enough condition for the fish to survive. Their days were numbered. Zorian, Zack prodded. Tell me, what do you know about time travel? Zorian blinked. Well. That was direct. Time travel? Zorian asked with as much confusion as he could fake. Not much, I guess. What's that got to do with anything? Well, Zack fumbled with words, scratching his chin nervously. You'll probably think I'm insane, but I'm a time traveler of sorts. Wow, Zack really didn't have a subtle bone in his body, did he? You don't look very old, Zorian remarked. If you come from the future, it must not be a very far one. No, it's more like, the whole world resets itself on the night of the summer festival, and I'm the only one who remembers what happened. That was an interesting way of explaining it, though the idea of a spell affecting the whole world was even more ridiculous than the idea of working time travel magic. I've lived through this month, God, at least 200 times by now, continued Zack. Honestly, I'm starting to lose count. Wait, you're talking about it like you can't stop it, said Zorian, unable to keep a tiny bit of alarm out of his voice. Luckily, Zack appeared to be too agitated to notice. That's just it, I don't know if I can stop it. Zack shouted, before he realized what he was doing and quieted down so as to not attract unneeded attention. I was hit by this spell in the previous revert, and its effects didn't completely go away when I reverted into the past. Zorian frowned. Previous revert? What about the other 7? Did Zack somehow skip those, or did he simply not remember them? It occurred to Zorian that the after effects of the Lich's spell could have been even more serious than what he was currently looking at, what if Zack had spent the past 7 restarts in a coma? Though that begged the question of why his guardian had reported him as missing instead of bringing a healer. I guess it really was a soul magic spell like you said, continued Zack. I need to watch out for those from now on. Anyway, at first I thought it's just some nasty sickness that'll pass, and to a degree I was right. I already feel a lot better than I did this morning. It's just that it wasn't only my body that was affected, my mind has been a little spotty ever since I woke up.
Oh no.
I don't remember how I started this time loop, concluded Zack, confirming Zorian's fears. Or whether it was me who started it in the first place. My memory is full of blanks like that at the moment. I'm hoping it will all come back to me but... Zorian stared at the other boy, stony-faced. Basically, they were both in deep shit. Zack seemed to interpret Zorian's serious look a little differently, though. You don't believe me, he concluded. It's pretty far-fetched, Zorian said. If he hadn't lived through it, he wouldn't have believed him, no. But I'm a pretty open-minded guy. Let's pretend you're right for the moment. What's that got to do with me? Zack arched an eyebrow at him, apparently incredulous about something. Huh, he said. You're really different from your other self. My other self? Zorian asked curiously.
Yeah.
Zack nodded. My memory may be spotty about some things, but I definitely remember you. Mostly because you kept dying at the start of the attack. Zack mumbled the last sentence in a quiet voice that probably wasn't meant to carry but did. Zorian pretended he didn't hear it. You're different than you used to be, Zack said. You were more irritable, and always busy with something or other. You never believed me when I tried to tell you about the whole time travel thing, you thought I was trying to make fun of you. Well, that kind of story sounded exactly like something his brothers would try to fool him with. And Zack did have a great many things in common with those two already. You've changed, Zack concluded. You're a lot calmer. More laid back, I guess. Zorian frowned. He didn't think he changed that much in personality, but he supposed it would be hard to not change when going through something like this. To say nothing of the fact that more than 8 months had passed since the restarts started for Zorian. So, wait, why did I change then? Zorian asked. Didn't you say the whole world resets itself? Don't know, Zack shrugged, then gave him a speculative look. Come to think of it, you were there too, weren't you? Zorian gave him a confused look. He wasn't going to get baited that easily. No, of course you don't remember, Zack sighed. Do you at least feel a little different lately or something? Come to think of it, yes, confirmed Zorian. I chose different electives than I intended to, for no good reason really, and I did a bunch of other strange things ever since I came to Syoria. Zorian's motivation for saying that was twofold. First of all, he wanted to see how Zack would react to the idea of another person going through the time loop with him. Secondly, he wanted to lay the groundwork for an explanation why he'd be acting differently in every restart, in case he decided not to tell Zack about himself. He was surprised that Zack was so willing to believe him, though. Apparently even after all this time, nearly 17 years, if the other boy was to be believed, Zack still hasn't developed an ability to effectively read people. That, or Zorian really was that good of an actor. Strange, was all Zack said.
Yeah,
Zorian agreed. So, any advice a time traveler can tell a mortal like me? A secret spell of awesomeness, maybe? To be honest, most of the spells I know are combat ones, Zack admitted. I'm really good at combat magic, which is good because I need to be good at it. There is something I'm trying to stop. Something involving the mysterious adversary that messed you up, tried Zorian. He really wanted to work the invasion into the conversation but didn't know how to justify knowing anything about it. Do you remember how that happened, at least?
Ugh.
Grunted Zack. Mostly. I distinctly remember you being there, but you probably died right at the start of the battle. No offense, Zorian, but you aren't much of a fighter, and then I stupidly charged in, thinking myself invulnerable. Why would you ever think that? Zorian asked, honestly confused. That you're invulnerable, I mean. Doesn't it strike you as dangerously arrogant to perceive yourself as invincible? Do you know how many times I've died in these reverts? Protested Zack. My memory is failing me again, but it was a lot. You tend not to take it too seriously after a while. And it's not like I was too far off, I just have to watch out for necromancy next time, right? Not just necromancy, Zorian replied with a heavy sigh. There is also mind magic to worry about. Aside from the obvious possibility of ending up as a mind thrall, you could also end up with more than a few gaps in your memory. You could have your whole mind blanked out. Then there is a possibility of having a haze forced upon you if you're too careless, which also bind to the soul as far as I know. Some creatures, such as wraiths, eat souls. That's another thing to worry about. And there are a couple of methods of sealing away a mage's ability to do magic, which might very well stay with you when you revert. Zack was silent, but Zorian could have sworn he had gotten even paler as he listened to Zorian speak. And that's just a couple of points off the top of my head, finished Zorian. I'm only an academy student, and I don't know anything. It's obvious. You are not invulnerable. Okay? Zorian swallowed heavily. That was close. It was fortunate that Zack was so oblivious, because had the situation been reversed, he would have called Zack out on it ages ago. Wow, you almost sound like you care, Zack finally said with a nervous chuckle. You really do believe I'm a time traveler now, huh? Zorian shrugged. I'm not completely convinced, but it's not something that's worth fighting over in my opinion. If you say you're a time traveler, then we'll pretend you're a time traveler. Yes. Until he got a better feel for Zack's character and understood what the deal was with the time loop, he would pretend. Break. When Zorian finally returned to school, having missed both the remainder of essential invocations and the following lecture about magical law, he was beset by curious classmates and AKO. AKO was easy to deal with, since she only wanted to scold him for taking too long and warn him she recorded his absence in the attendance record. Zorian was pretty sure the only person, teachers included, who cared about what was written on that list was Akoja. The ones that wanted to know what's wrong with Zack were also easy. It was an alchemical accident. What? It's the excuse Zack used. Unfortunately, many people also wanted to know why he had suddenly volunteered to take him home, or what had taken him so long. Nosy people. And they were persistent too, refusing to leave him alone for the rest of the day. When Zorian finally reached his room, he immediately locked his door and breathed a sigh of relief. He finally had enough time to think about what he found out today. Zack was confident he would be fine by tomorrow, and that his memory would come back to him. Zorian was not nearly as confident. That Zack had a 7-month gap in his memory, and possibly existence, suggested something very serious had been done to him. Why hadn't Zorian suffered anything of the sort? Well, maybe he had. He had felt uncharacteristically tired in his first restart, but had written it off as mental stress. Maybe he had only been caught at the very edge of the spell and thus only suffered minor damage, or maybe his first restart was only the first one he had memory of. It was a disturbing possibility, but there was not much point in dwelling on it much. It really wasn't that unexpected, when you really thought about it. The strange time travel effect he and Zack were under had essentially turned them into soul entities. A lich was, at its core, also a soul entity. They were mages that ritually killed themselves and tethered their souls to an object, their phylactery, before it could move on into the afterlife. If the form they currently inhabited ever got destroyed, they'd snap back to their phylactery and simply possess someone. It would make sense for a lich to know how to fight another lich. And a method that worked against a lich would work just as well against him and Zack. And Zack had stupidly said as much to the lich at the end of their battle. "It's not like I'll be dead for good, indeed." The lich may not have known what Zack was exactly, but a statement like that strongly suggested he was either a lich himself or some kind of a possessor entity, and from a practical standpoint it wasn't that far off. But that was all neither here nor there. The real question was, what was he going to do now? Even if Zack regained his memories, doubtful, he would no doubt want to keep the time loop going until he found a way to defeat the lich. If the boy's previous altercation with the undead mage was of any indication, that could take a while. And that was assuming Zack was the originator of the spell in the first place. If it happened once, it could have happened twice. He had a sneaking suspicion that Zack might be as much of a stowaway as Zorian was. Was there a third looping person running around? Suddenly, he didn't feel as desperate to get out of this thing as he was at the start of it. Getting out might not necessarily mean going back to normal. The invasion was clearly more than a random terrorist attack, and Zorian somehow doubted that stopping it would be the end of it. Something very big was happening, and Zorian was a very small fish. A roach, as Taven would charmingly say. Inside the time loop, he had a chance to secure his future. Outside of it, he was just another victim. Besides, if Zack was to be believed, normal for Zorian meant getting killed at the start of the invasion. He didn't care much for that kind of normal. In fact, the more he thought about it, the more it seemed to him this whole thing was a giant opportunity rather than an annoyance. Once upon a time, when Zorian was younger, he dreamt of being a great mage. The sort that legends were made of, the kind that revolutionized whole fields of magic all by themselves. In time this dream died as it became clear he didn't have the talent, the work ethic, or the right connections to make that happen. He was just a slightly above average civilian-born student with no special advantages to his name. But now? He had all the time he needed to build up an advantage over his peers and become truly great. Greater than Daimen. He shook his head, abandoning that train of thought. He was getting ahead of himself. He needed something more concrete than a fuzzy notion of greatness to guide him, a clear set of goals to achieve, and courses of action to pursue. Right now, the only thing he could think of was harassing Zack for some tips, raiding the library for more spells, and leveraging his curious monetary situation to improve his alchemical skills. He was leery about relying on Zack for help. Even if the boy would be cooperative, there was only so much he could learn from the other time traveler without revealing that he too retained his memories each time they reverted to the past. The library was full of spells, of course, but anything serious, that is, that could be used for combat, crime, or spying, was restricted, and he knew from talking to older students that teachers were really stingy with permission slips. Not even Fortov succeeded in getting one, and he could charm a troll into not eating him. Honing his alchemy skills was definitely an option. The only reason he focused more heavily on invocation thus far was because he had to buy any ingredients he wished to work with, and he was trying to save money. Any serious study of alchemy required a lot of funds. Alchemical ingredients were expensive. With his saving account spontaneously refilling after each restart, however, monetary concerns didn't limit him as much as they did before. It wasn't much, to be honest. He needed a better plan. With another sigh, Zorian pulled out his trusty notebook and began to plot and write. Break. Something I can do for you, Sonny? Asked Karen. The class has been dismissed, in case you didn't notice. I noticed. I just wanted to talk to you about something, Zorian said. Karen gestured him to keep talking. I hope you don't find it insulting, but your stated program seems a bit easy. Practicing magic missile for a whole month seems rather pointless to me, since I already have a pretty good grasp on it. Kirin stared at him for a few seconds. Zorian suppressed the instinct to shuffle nervously in place and returned the man's stare. Kirin seemed like a sort of person who would be impressed by that. I hope you don't find it insulting, Sunny, but you just don't have enough power to be a proper battle mage, Kirin finally said. Your shaping skills are rather impressive for your age, but you tire after only 10 shots from the rod. And that just won't do in any serious combat. Well, I kind of know that, admitted Zorian. His reserves had increased slightly from what they were when he first tackled this class, so 10 shots was actually an improvement. Incidentally, is there anything I can do about that? Nothing I would recommend, Kirin said, shaking his head. Your mana reserves will grow as your proficiency in magic grows, of course, but so will everyone else's. You will always be at a disadvantage against naturally powerful opponents, which would be most of the professional battle mages. Of course, I cannot forbid you from pursuing a career as a battle mage, but I definitely advise you against it. There are plenty of magical disciplines where great shaping skills are an asset, but combat magic is mostly about power. I see, said Zorian. He didn't intend to become a battle mage, but he had a feeling he was going to need some combat magic, whether he liked it or not. At the very least he wanted to be able to deal with any stray winter wolves or trolls he might encounter during the invasion. Though my point still stands. Since I can already do the spell well enough, and that's the only thing you intend to instruct us in for the foreseeable future, I can see little point in attending the class for the foreseeable future. Humph, Kirin snorted. Trying blackmail on me, Sunny? It's fine, I don't mind. And I do understand your point of view here. Kirin rubbed his chin for a second, mulling something over in his head. Wait here. 15 minutes later Kirin returned with another spell rod, a small booklet, and 4 ceramic plates. He threw the plates towards Zorian, who hastily caught them before they shattered upon the ground. Good reflexes, Kirin complimented. They're actually reinforced, so you don't have to worry about dropping them too much. He took one of the spell rods they used in class and grasped it firmly in his hand. Let me demonstrate something to you. Throw one of the plates to my left. Zorian immediately complied, and Kirin wordlessly pointed the rod in the plate's general direction and fired. He was wide of the mark, but the bolt of force actually homed in on the plate anyway, curving through the air to intercept it. The plate shattered into dust and sharp fragments. Again, Kirin snapped. Zorian threw another plate, and another bolt of force sped towards it. This one was different, however, it was longer and thinner, like an oversized needle. It hit the plate, but instead of smashing it to pieces it went right through it, punching a hole through the center before dissipating. Throw the last 2 together, Kirin instructed. 2 plates flew into the air, and Kirin once again pointed the rod in their general direction. Zorian waited for the bolt of force, but none was forthcoming. Instead, both plates were suddenly cut in half by some unseen blades. Kirin lowered his hand and began to speak. The reason I'll be spending so much time on Magic Missile is because it's a very versatile spell, Kirin spoke. In its simplest form, it takes the form of a shining bolt of force that travels in a straight line, delivering concussive blasts of force to whatever it impacts. This variant is often called the Smasher, and it is a very simple and effective spell. A skilled mage can do so much more with it, however. You can use animation magic to make it home in on a target. You can sharpen it into a point that will pierce things instead of batter them, or a line to cut them, the piercer and cutter, respectively. You can fire multiple missiles instead of one, a swarm even, if you have the reserves and skill to pull it off. And, of course, you can make the projectile invisible. Invisible? Asked Zorian. Yes, Kirin agreed. A perfectly cast force spell is completely transparent. The light show you usually see is magical leakage resulting from an imperfect spell boundary. The speed with which combat magic is cast virtually guarantees that some mistakes in constructing the spell boundary will be made, and even if no mistakes are made, the large amounts of mana pumped into the constructs can easily distort or unravel some of the pieces. "So I'm messing the spell up," summarized Zorian, thinking of the brightly shining projectiles he always got when he used the rod. "Wait, your missiles normally shine too. Is that Dash?" Kirin chuckled. "Like I said at the start, there are plenty of magical disciplines where great shaping skills are an asset, but combat magic is mostly about power. Most battle mages can't even make a simple magic missile transparent, much less one of the higher level force spells. It doesn't hold them back any. Even I usually don't bother, since the benefits are so marginal. You, on the other hand, need every advantage you can get." Kirin pushed the spell rod and the accompanying booklet into Zorian's hands. "You are right that you won't learn much in class in the next month or so. The Smasher may be simple, but more than half of your classmates are having trouble with it as it is, and you're the only one that truly has a good grasp on it. So read the booklet, find some targets to practice on, and make sure there is a friend nearby while you practice to get help if you screw up big. Oh, and don't hurt anyone with the rod I'm loaning you or I'll be mad. Come back to me in 2 weeks so I can see how you're progressing." "Right," agreed Zorian enthusiastically. This went a lot better than he thought it would. "Now get lost," Kirin gestured towards the door. "You've wasted my entire coffee break already." "Break?" Zorian dropped the stack of books on a nearby table and surveyed the shelves. He had decided to try his luck as a library employee again, hoping he would find a way to get around spell restrictions as an employee. Zack had been absent from class for a couple of days at this point, probably still suffering from the aftereffects of the soul spell, so he couldn't simply trick the answer out of his fellow time traveler. And besides, he wanted to learn those book divinations he was promised before being brutally murdered, and all. He wasn't in a hurry to get Kirithishli to teach him those divination spells, though. The magic missile variations Kirin gave him to practice were giving him enough problems as it was. Like Kirin had said at the beginning of the lecture, the problem was that shaping had to be done in an instant and involved shoving a great deal of his mana reserves into a hastily constructed spell boundary. That was easy enough when you just wanted a bolt that traveled in a straight line and smashed things, but trying to weave, say, a homing function into the spell was a chore to do in a fraction of a second. To say nothing of trying to eliminate all the little imperfections and make the bolt transparent. Which is not to say he made no progress. He could make the bolt curve towards a target even if his aim was a little off, and he managed to make a flawless piercer yesterday. Progress. "You're pretty good at this stuff," Ivory remarked beside him, putting a book on the shelf. "I'm surprised. Usually it takes a while for people to really understand the system we use here. I guess you worked in a library before, huh?"
Yeah.
Agreed Zorian. It was technically true. It was surprisingly similar to this one in organization. "It's not really surprising," Kirithishli said behind him, causing him to jump in surprise. "All state libraries use the same organizing system. It's a standard enforced by the Society of Librarians. Hell, even the systems of other splinter nations are pretty similar. Because they all used to be part the same country," guessed Zorian. "It is debatable whether or not the Old Alliance could be considered a unified state," Kirithishli said. "The name says it all, really. It was an alliance more than anything. Arguably it was the attempt to turn it into a state that led to the Splinter Wars. But yes, being once part of the Old Alliance, the Splinter Nations inherited much of its administrative legacy, including library organization." Zorian was starting to understand why Kirithishli had such strained relations with the current headmaster. He knew very little about the man, but what he did suggested he was very politically involved and, well, patriotic. And the country they were living in made its official position clear: there was no old alliance, because the alliance of Eldamar never ended. It simply shrank. That this was a completely ridiculous claim was self-evident to citizens domestic and foreigner alike, but most found it easier to humor the politicians. Kirithishle apparently went a step further and denied there was a predecessor state to be an inheritor of in the first place. A fiery, opinionated woman that she was, she probably said something of the sort within the headmaster's earshot. That must have been a fun conversation. "Hey," called a familiar voice. "Is Zorian here?" I heard dash. "Don't shout in the library, Zack," Zorian sighed. "Since you're back to your usual exuberance, I'm guessing you're all right now?" "Yup," Zack said happily, thumping his chest a few times. "Healthy like an oak. Got an hour to grab something to eat?" "In case you haven't noticed, I'm working at the moment," Zorian protested. "It's not an issue, Zorian, we're mostly done for the day," Kirithishle pointed out. Then she leaned towards him and whispered into his ear. "Unless you wanted to get rid of him and I'm interfering?" Zorian waved her concerns away and followed Zack outside. As amusing as it would be to see what Kirithishle would say to Zack to get rid of him, he actually wanted to talk to the boy. "So how come you sought me out?" Zorian asked. He thought he'd have to hound the boy to get more information, but it seemed Zack had taken a liking to him. He didn't know whether to be pleased or annoyed by that. It was convenient, but it increased the chances that he'd realize something was off with Zorian. "You're the most interesting person I know of at the moment, and the only other person who believes me about time travel except Nialu," Zack said. "Nialu?" asked Zorian incredulously. "She's an avid reader of speculative fiction and mysteries and is very imaginative and open-minded," said Zack. "A naive dreamer," her father would say. "It was surprisingly easy to convince her I'm really a time traveler. I guess she wants to believe it's true." Said Zorian. He supposed that he knew now why Zack involved Nialu so much the first time he went through this month. He still didn't know who the other girl was, though, and didn't know how he might work her into the conversation. "How many people did you try to convince, anyway?" asked Zorian. "All of our classmates and teachers, the headmaster, and the heads of every police department in the city. A couple of nobles and other influential people." "How persistent." "Not very successful, I imagine," Zorian guessed. "That's putting it mildly," Zack sighed. Zorian frowned, suddenly realizing something. Why did Zack try to convince all those people he was a time traveler? That didn't sound like something a time traveler that came specifically to stop the invasion would do. It sounded more like something Zorian briefly considered when he realized how utterly over the head he was, but ultimately decided to scrap the idea because he expected the results to be more or less identical to what Zack got. "Zack," began Zorian carefully, "what about those gaps in your memory?" "Are they?" "They're still there," Zack scowled. "I'm pretty sure they're not increasing anymore though, thank the gods." Agreed Zorian. "So you don't know how you achieved this time travel magic, then?" "I looked it up, and it's supposed to be impossible, you know? As impossible as drawing a square triangle, in fact." "Well, it's clearly not that impossible, is it?" Zack countered. "But no, I have no idea how I did that." "If I did that." "If you did that," agreed Zorian. "From your comments I'm getting a feeling you started these reverts as a common academy student. And I mean no offense, but the Zack I remember wasn't really the kind of person capable of inventing any spell, much less something as concept-breaking as time travel." Zack chuckled nervously. "You're probably right. I used to be really bad at this whole mage business, didn't I? But enough of such depressing topics, because I've got good news for you. Oh? Zorian asked curiously. Yes, Zack confirmed. I heard you've been trying to learn combat magic. Where did you hear that? Protested Zorian. Kirin told the rest of the teachers told the administrative staff told the janitors and other low-paying workers, they told the students, and the students told me, finished Zack. What does it matter? What matters is that I'm very good at combat magic thanks to the reverts, and that I've decided to teach you. Think of it as a reward for believing me. Zorian gave Zack an incredulous look. He was going to help him out on his own free will? Just like that? No need for any plotting or subtle maneuvering. Almost disappointing. What? Zack protested. It's true, I really am good at combat magic. In fact, that's the field I'm most talented at. Oh, now that's a wonderful opening. Not that I don't believe you, but how exactly did you get so good at combat magic? Asked Zorian. I mean, mages are really stingy about sharing combat magic. Even with these reverts, why would they share them with an academy student like you? Especially since you're known to be irresponsible, Zack finished for him. To be honest, I didn't get the spells I know legally. I wouldn't recommend my methods of acquiring combat magic to anyone who isn't a time traveler. You tend to die a lot. Oh.
Yeah.
But you have me, so there's that. Quietly wondering what he was getting himself into, Zorian followed after him. Chapter 008. Perspective. Here we are, said Zack happily, twirling around with his hands outstretched. What do you think? Zorian studied the meadow in front of him, his eyes darting back and forth with suspicion. At first glance the area was just a large patch of grass surrounded by a ring of trees, but Zorian couldn't help but notice signs of obvious neglect. The grass was too wild and tall, and the space between trees was full of young saplings fighting for their own place under the sun. It was a good place to practice combat magic at, but also a good place to hide a body in. In an even remotely normal situation, Zorian wouldn't be caught dead following a complete stranger into a creepy, isolated place like this one. Oh, how far his perspective had shifted. I wonder what's keeping the saplings confined to that ring of trees, wondered Zorian aloud. This meadow should be a copse of trees by now. Zack blinked. I never thought about that, he admitted. You notice the strangest things, Zorian. I also wonder how a place like this can exist at all, Zorian continued. I mean, we're in Cyoria. Land is very expensive here. Why is someone letting this place deteriorate like this instead of selling it? Oh, that's easy, Zack said. It's my land. Or rather, it's part of the Novita family estates. It's supposed to be a private garden for the head of house, or something like that, so no one could do anything with it unless they had my explicit permission. But since I hadn't even known this place existed before the reverts.
Yeah.
Zorian agreed. I guess I should have expected something like that. Your home is pretty close from here, isn't it? You know where I live? Zack asked, surprise evident in his voice. Crap. What to say? Of course I know where you live, Zorian said, looking at Zack like the boy was an idiot for asking. Who doesn't know where the Novita estate is located? A lot of people, probably. Zorian himself certainly hadn't known, not until he tried to track Zack down in one of the restarts. I'm pretty famous, aren't I? Zack said, grinning widely. Note to self, Zack is easy to distract by appealing to his pride.
Yeah,
sighed Zorian. So is the great Novita going to help me learn combat magic like he promised or not? Daylight's burning. Zack snapped his fingers, apparently remembering just why they came here in the first place. His hands blurred into a sequence of gestures, and several humanoids made of earth rose from the ground on the other side of the clearing. Zorian gaped. Now that was impressive. Zack didn't even have to chant anything to cast that spell, and he went through the gestures with such speed Zorian had trouble remembering what they even were. Plus, those earthen constructs weren't just immobile statues, they moved. It was in times like this that Zorian remembered he was dealing with a vastly superior mage that had him beat in virtually every conceivable way. It was humbling, to say the least. Wow, he said out loud. It's not as impressive as it looks, Zack said. They're nearly useless in actual battle. They make good targets though, since they're pretty resilient and reform each time you mess them up. Zack fired a quick magic missile at one of the statues to demonstrate, hitting it square in the chest. The earthen construct took a step back from the force of the bolt, and a web of cracks erupted from the impact point, but the cracks quickly sealed themselves shut and the construct otherwise completely ignored the attack. I don't believe this, Zorian stated incredulously. What do you mean? Zack asked. They're just animated earth, so it's dash. Not them, Zorian protested. The magic missile. No chant, no gestures, no spell formula, no nothing. You just pointed your finger at the target and produced a magic missile. Which, admittedly, was a gesture. Not one that should be sufficient to produce a magic missile, though. Oh, that, Zack said, waving his hand dismissively. That's not terribly special either. That's just reflexive magic. When you cast a spell enough times dash, mana shaping becomes instinctive and you can start leaving out spell components, finished Zorian for him. Any serious mage had at least a couple of spells they knew so intimately they could leave out a couple of words and gestures and still get it working. But getting a spell to work with something as simple as pointing a finger would take years. Zack simply grinned from ear to ear. Which? I guess you had, Zorian concluded, feeling rather stupid. This time travel thing is really convenient, isn't it? How many reflexive spells do you have, anyway? You mean, how many are as reflexive as the magic missile I just showed you? Shield, hurl, recall, flamethrower, and a couple of other easy combat spells. There are a lot of spells I'm familiar with, but I can't exactly throw fireballs by pointing my fingers. Right, said Zorian sourly. He was getting way past humbling and straight into feeling mightily inadequate territory. Better steer the conversation back to the lesson before Zack completely demoralized him. So where do we start? Kieran gave you a spell rod and told you to practice magic missile, didn't he? Asked Zack.
Yeah,
confirmed Zorian. Well, let's see how that's working out for you first, said Zack, waving his hand in the direction of the earthen constructs. Fire a couple of missiles at the mud people. Mud people? Asked Zorian incredulously. Is that dash? Probably not, Zack admitted. I kind of forgot the official name of the spell, so I just refer to it as create mud people. It doesn't matter all that much since the spell is obscure and obsolete, and virtually no one except me uses it. I guess, agreed Zorian. He was tempted to ask more, but figured he would never get to actual spell practice if he kept distracting Zack with his questions. He pointed the spell rod Kieran gave him at the closest mud person, and fired. He was a bit surprised when the construct tried to sidestep his magic missile instead of soaking the spell like it did when Zack targeted it, but that didn't save it. He had enough control of the spell to alter the missile's flight path accordingly, even if he couldn't get the bolt to home in on the target on its own. Of course, the bolt did very little actual damage to the construct, and even that repaired itself quickly. Undeterred, Zorian kept firing. His next shot was a piercer aimed at the head of the construct, which succeeded in hitting it squarely in the forehead but failed to actually punch through the animated earth. He tried to shape the next bolt into a cutter, but all he got was a diffuse blob of multicolored light that popped like a soap bubble halfway to the target. The next two were regular smashers, one of which missed when its target leaned to the side at the last moment before the bolt hit him. Zorian stopped at this point, not wanting to completely deplete his mana reserves. He demonstrated pretty much everything he achieved so far, anyway. Zack clapped over dramatically, completely ignoring the mild glare Zorian sent his way. "You've only been practicing, what, for a couple of days?" asked Zack. Zorian nodded. "And you can direct your bolts already? You're a lot better than I thought you'd be." "Oh," asked Zorian, a hint of warning in his voice. "And why is that?" "Let me ask you this instead. How many magic missiles can you cast before you run out of mana?" asked Zack. 10, answered Zorian. He didn't see what that, normally learning time corresponds to mana capacity, doesn't it? Yup. The bigger your mana reserves, the longer you can train each day, confirmed Zack. It means mages with larger reserves tend to learn faster than their less gifted compatriots. Assuming everyone is equally dedicated and equally good at shaping mana, noted Zorian. Assuming that, agreed Zack. Though the difference in mana reserves tends to overshadow almost everything else. "Do you know how many magic missiles I can cast before I run out of mana?" Zorian hadn't forgotten Zack's seemingly inexhaustible mana reserves that he demonstrated during the invasion, and was aware that the number must be pretty high. Still, there was a limit to how big your mana reserves could get. The booklet Kirin gave him said average mages can fire somewhere between 8 to 12 magic missiles before running out of mana, while very gifted ones could manage as much as 20 or 30. Furthermore, while mana reserves increased with age and practice, they were not unlimited in potential. Most people's maximum was roughly 4 times the amount of mana reserves they started with, and usually less. Assuming Zack was in the above-average range, something his comments and attitude strongly suggested, and that he achieved his maximum due to the time loop. 50, he tried. 232, said Zack smugly. Zorian almost dropped the spell rod in shock, but in the end settled for staring at Zack like he just swallowed a live chicken. 232? What the hell? Admittedly, I'm at the extreme high end when it comes to mana reserves, Zack said. Understatement of the century. And unlike you, I've spent years building them up, so they're as high as they're ever going to be. Still, even if you had a lifetime of practice, you'd probably never go over 40. That would make my reserves almost 6 times larger than yours. Quite a disadvantage to make up for. No kidding, agreed Zorian. I'm guessing that's where you come in. Unless you've brought me here just to tell me how much I suck compared to you?
Ha!
I admit the look on your face when you realized how awesome I am was absolutely priceless, but that's just a bonus, said Zack. He beckoned for Zorian to come closer and Zorian complied, allowing Zack to cast a completely unfamiliar spell on him. Zorian felt the spell seep into his eyes, foreign mana straining against the innate magical resistance possessed by every living creature, and briefly considered snuffing the spell out before it took root. Not because he thought the spell was harmful, mind you, but out of principle. Zack just cast a spell on him without asking for permission or explaining what the spell did, which was a major breach of magical etiquette no matter how you looked at it. In the end he decided not to be that spiteful and simply reeled in his magical resistance, allowing the spell to do its work unopposed. You already have control over your magical resistance? Asked Zack. Sweet. I usually have to teach people how to do that, first. Hell, I didn't know how to do that before the reverts. Zorian frowned, ignoring Zack's comments in favor of trying to figure out what the spell actually did. It was concentrated in his eyes, so he should see. Oh. A glowing, mind-bogglingly huge pillar rose into the sky, warping and undulating like a living being, occasionally spawning short-lived whirls of glowing matter along its length. It only took Zorian a moment to realize what he was looking at. "That's how the hole looks like under mage sight," he asked, focusing back on Zack. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Zack said. "Watching that huge geyser of mana rising into the sky always puts things into perspective for me." "Mage sight shouldn't work in Cyoria, though," remarked Zorian. "Too much ambient mana saturating everything. Why aren't I blinded by painful glow emanating from everything in sight?" "It's an experimental variation that tries to filter out such noise, showing only the important stuff," said Zack. "It's not terribly reliable, but it will do for our purposes." "Those being?" asked Zorian. "I'll cast Magic Missile repeatedly and you'll watch what I'm doing for a while before trying to copy me," Zack said. "I'll be using the proper invocation this time, and go at it as slowly as I can. Try to memorize the words and gestures, because you'll be using them instead of the rod Kirin gave you. A spell rod is more useful in combat, but for training purposes it's better to work with actual invocations." Zorian was completely on board with the idea. He had been trying to find invocations for combat spells for a while now, anyway. Zack was underestimating him, though. Try to memorize? Zorian might not have Zack's absurd mana reserves, but his memory was quite good. It took only one proper casting from Zack and Zorian had already burned the casting procedure into his memory. Unfortunately, the rest of the session was a lot less impressive. Zack kept performing the spell a few more times before instructing Zorian to give it a try, upon which he found out that performing combat magic with classical invocations wasn't only slower than using a spell rod, it was a lot harder too. Thankfully, the fact that he actually saw how the mana was supposed to be shaped during Zack's demonstration drastically improved his learning speed, so he managed to fire off a passable magic missile in the end. He was completely out of mana by then, however, and Zack decided that was a good time to stop for the day. Walking back to his apartment, Zorian was lost in thought. Zack's comment about the giant pillar of mana putting things into perspective for him seemed oddly applicable to his situation as well. Time loop or not, he would never beat Zack and people like him at their own game. Clearly Zorian couldn't bulldoze his way through with combat magic, like Zack intended to do. No, if he was going to get out of this in a favorable manner, he had to forge his own path. If only he knew what that path was, though. At the moment, getting to the bottom of what caused this time loop and how the damn thing worked seemed to be just about the only thing he could do to help himself. Which was unfortunate, because he just didn't have the skills to unravel the mystery. Apparently he had to spend some time improving his magical abilities. Time, at least, he had in spades. Probably. He could never be sure the time loop would continue happening, but Zack certainly didn't behave like it would end any time soon, and Zorian decided to follow Zack's lead in that regard. He really wished he had someone other than Zack to ask for advice on how to proceed in his quest to improve himself. Typically, this was what a student's mentor was for, but he already knew what Svim would tell him, more shaping exercises. Then he'd throw marbles at him. Although Ilsa did offer to take over his mentorship in a couple of restarts, didn't she? Break. Despite his desire for some additional help, Zorian delayed approaching Ilsa until he actually had a few sessions with Svim. That would require a lengthy wait, but it would make it easier to complain about Svim's mentoring methods, since he wouldn't have to explain how he knew so much about the man already. It wasn't like he didn't have anything to amuse himself in the meantime. Zack was, if anything, even more enthusiastic about their combat magic practice sessions than Zorian was, insisting they meet up every day after classes. After 2 weeks of such practice, Zorian was not only able to weave a proper homing function into the magic missile spell, but also learned how to cast shield and flamethrower spells as well. He was keenly aware that his ability to cast such spells would amount to exactly 0 against a human battle mage, but he also knew they weren't the only threats he faced. Those spells might buy him a second or two against a winter wolf or a troll, which could be the difference between life and death. Zack returned to classes the day after their first practice session, apparently completely recovered. For a guy that lost a good chunk of his memory, he was surprisingly exuberant. Zorian admired his fellow time traveler for his ability to maintain good cheer in poor circumstances, but Zack's attention-grabbing behavior only made his inexplicable improvement in skill that much more noticeable. It was almost a repeat of the very first time he lived through this month, only instead of hanging out with Nialu and that other mystery girl, Zack was hanging out with him. Which, of course, made Zorian a target for every curious classmate that wanted to know how Zack suddenly got so good all of a sudden. "What am I supposed to tell them?" he asked Zack. They were both in the cafeteria, and he had noticed a couple of students glancing at him a bit too often, doubtlessly waiting for the chance to talk to him when Zack left. "I can't exactly tell them you're a time traveler." "Why not?" Zack asked. "Time travel. It's what I say every time they ask me how I got this good." "You actually tell them you're a time traveler?" asked Zorian incredulously. He didn't know whether to laugh or bang his head against the table.
"Yeah,"
confirmed Zack. "What's the worst that could happen?" Zorian felt a pang of phantom pain in his chest where, in another timeline, a masked assassin stabbed him through and killed him. Did Zack honestly never experience consequences like that when trying to convince people of his story? Then again, he said he tried to convince them he was a time traveler, not that he told them about the invasion. In fact, he didn't actually tell Zorian about that either. He danced around the topic whenever Zorian tried to lead the conversation in that particular direction. This could have all been avoided if you just held back a little in classes, Zorian sighed. "I kind of like the attention," Zack admitted. "Really?" asked Zorian. "I'm only going through this once and I'm already sick of it." "You're saying the novelty of all that attention still hasn't worn off after, what, more than a decade?" "Oh come on, do you really think I spend these reverts attending classes, of all things?" scoffed Zack. "That got seriously old after the third revert or so. I spend most of the time doing my own thing. Hell, usually I'm not even near Syoria. I only attend the classes when I want to relax or when I am feeling nostalgic. The only reason why I'm here right now is because I got kind of roughed up in my last revert and I'm still trying to sort out the holes in my memory." "Oh, and because you've kind of caught my interest." "Why did I catch your interest, though?" asked Zorian. "Not that I'm complaining or anything, but how come you're willing to invest so much time in me? Isn't it all going to be useless in the next revert?" "That's a pretty cold way of thinking about things," Zack said. "I don't really think like that. I've tried to get to know all of our classmates in these reverts, even though some of them were pretty uncooperative with the idea, and I've never thought of it as a waste of time. This is the first time I've gotten you this friendly, and I have no idea what exactly I did to cause that. It's best to make use of it while I can." Now he was starting to feel pretty bad. Not only had he never tried to get to know any of his classmates during the reverts, the idea had never even occurred to him. And this wasn't the first time Zack had insinuated that Zorian was kind of a jerk to him in the past. Just what had happened between Zack and past Zorian to leave that much of an impression? "I see," said Zorian uncertainly, not knowing how to respond to that. "I really do wonder about you, though," Zack continued. "You're so different from the Zorian I knew, I'm starting to wonder if you're really the same person." "Who else would I be?" asked Zorian, honestly at a loss as to where Zack was going with this. He didn't appear to have figured out that Zorian was reverting, as he would say, so what was he getting at? "I think I may have shifted timelines, or something," Zack said. Zorian gave him an incredulous look. Shifted timelines? That's his explanation? Really? Really? He almost revealed himself right then and there, just so he could tell him how silly that was. Almost. Or something, deadpanned Zorian.
What?
Protested Zack. It could happen. Do you know how temporal mechanics work? No? Didn't think so. I did look up a couple of books about time travel after our first meeting, said Zorian. It was a lie, of course, but only a small one. He had sifted through time travel-related texts, just not in this particular restart. And learned nothing, concluded Zack. It's a total wasteland. All they write about is about various ethical dilemmas and time paradoxes and whatnot. That was the first and last time I set foot in the Academy library, let me tell you. Zorian gave him a strange look. That was a joke, right? Which part? Zack asked. The part where you only visited the Academy library once, clarified Zorian. Well, tried Zack, chuckling nervously. What can I say? I don't really like to read. Zorian stared at Zack, wondering if the boy was pulling his leg. He would totally understand if the old Zack, the one he knew before the time loop, told him he never set foot in the library. He wouldn't be terribly unique in that regard. Lots of students never visited the library before their third year, since they couldn't access the spell repository before their certification, anyway. But this Zack had lived through this month over 200 times, and had access to the spells buried within its depths. And he never tried to search through it. Because he didn't like to read. The mind boggled. Well, Zorian's mind boggled. You've clearly read our textbooks, Zorian noted. There's no way you'd excel as well as you do otherwise.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't say I don't read at all, Zack countered. Just that I'd rather avoid it if I can. I learn much better by example anyway. Funny, it was just the opposite with Zorian. He tended to learn much better when he had the chance to study the topic on his own before trying. He still thought it was a pretty serious flaw for a mage to avoid books, but Zorian had to remind himself that Zack was clearly achieving results somehow. Come to think of it, there was a serious shortage of anything dangerous in the Academy spell collection, so a mage that was chiefly interested in the more restricted areas of magic would find the library of very limited usefulness. So you learn primarily by mentorship, guessed Zorian. I'm surprised you can convince mages to teach you in less than a month. Don't they all require apprenticeships lasting for several years before they'll agree to teach you anything useful? Well, usually, said Zack. But I'm the last Novita, don't you know? I had highly respectable mages tripping over themselves to teach me my whole life. Usually I just have to show up and tell them who I am and they're all too happy to help me out. Zorian suppressed a wave of jealousy that washed over him. Zack was just making the most of his unique situation, just like Zorian would have in his place. It still bothered him, though, reminding him of how Daimen and Fortov could ask and get all sorts of help and concessions from their teachers, only for Zorian to fail in securing the same for himself. His parents had lectured him endlessly that the difference was in their attitudes, that if only Zorian was more sociable, more polite, more everything, he too could enjoy the same benefits. To Zorian, it always seemed like his brothers had some sort of invisible tattoo on their foreheads that only mages could see, and which marked them as somehow more special than him. Zack wasn't his brothers, though, and didn't deserve to be the target for Zorian's personal frustrations. Convenient, said Zorian out loud, giving his fellow time traveler a smile that was somewhat forced. Zack didn't appear to notice. His jealousy aside, he was really starting to wonder if his assumption about Zack being an accidental stowaway like him had any merit at all. Zack had ridiculously huge mana reserves, probably the largest of any student currently attending the academy. He was the last member of a famous noble house, enjoying all the prestige that comes from that without having to deal with nosy parents who might be freaked out by Zack's sudden transformation. In addition to the power inherent in his name, the boy was also fairly charming and outgoing, further improving his chances of getting help from otherwise unapproachable high-circle mages. He was not your average spoiled prince, by any means. There was a lot of potential in the boy, if only he would get enough time to bring it out. Time that Zack now had. It was convenient. A bit too convenient, in Zorian's opinion. That is why, despite Zack's seeming friendliness, Zorian just didn't feel at ease with the boy. Not enough to reveal himself as a stowaway, in any case. Right now, his main advantage was that he was an outside element in this game Zack was playing. An unaccounted variable. He intended to use and abuse that advantage for all it was worth. Whatever force was behind Zack, Zorian had no intention of revealing himself to it any time soon. Break. Take a seat, Mr. Kaczynski, Ilsa said. I sort of suspected I'd be seeing you soon. You did? Asked Zorian. Oh yes, Ilsa said. Usually students come knocking at my door immediately after a single session with Svim. You actually waited until the second one, so points for patience. Right, said Zorian sourly. I can't transfer you to another mentor at this time, though, so I'm afraid you'll just have to bear with him for now, she said. I sort of expected that, Zorian said. Why should her answer be any different than it was the last time he asked her? It's not what I'm here for. No, asked Ilsa, raising an eyebrow. No, confirmed Zorian. Since everything I've heard and experienced about Svim suggests we'll never progress beyond the basic 3, I've decided to be proactive about self-study. I've been hoping for some pointers from you, where I should start, what I should watch out for, that sort of thing. Ilsa sighed heavily. It's hard to give that sort of advice, Mr. Kaczynski. That's why the Academy gives students mentors, because there is no one-size-fits-all solution. I suppose I could give you advice about my own subject, though. How good are you at the basic 3? Depends who you ask, said Zorian. Most of the teachers from my second year told me I had them mastered. Svim says I'm ashamed to mages everywhere. She snorted and handed him a pen. Actually handed it to him, not threw it at him like Svim would have. Ah, the joy of interacting with sane teachers. Levitate that, Ilsa said. She wasn't even finished talking and the pen was already spinning above his outstretched palm. Oh, so you can already spin the levitated object? Ilsa said, sounding pleased. I bet Svim was very happy with that. No, not really. Do you know any other variation? No, said Zorian. Don't tell me learning those is standard procedure? Not like Svim is teaching them, Ilsa said. But yes, most mentors will give students variations of the basic 3 to improve their shaping skills. And how many of those variations are there? Asked Zorian. Oh, thousands, said Ilsa, confirming Zorian's suspicions. But most students only learn 6 or so by the end of their 3rd year. Here. She pushed a rather heavy book into his hands, patiently waiting for him to leaf through it. It was apparently a book describing 15 particularly interesting variations of the basic 3, 5 for each exercise. Let me guess, you want me to learn everything inside this book, Zorian sighed. That would be a pretty neat trick, Ilsa snorted. Didn't you hear what I said? Most people learn 6 or less, in a year. You'll probably be finished with the academy by the time you've learned everything inside that book. Assuming you want to, of course, I'm not making you do anything. 6 in a year, huh? Asked Zorian carefully, an idea forming in his mind. That's right, Ilsa confirmed. So what if I could master all 15 before this month is done? Asked Zorian. Ilsa stared at him for a second before bursting into laughter. It took her a few seconds to calm down. My, aren't you the confident one? Ilsa said, chuckling softly. If you were really that good, I'd fill out the transfer forms right now, regulations be damned, and take you as my apprentice. I'd never pass up an opportunity to teach such a legend in the making. Not that I think you could do it, mind you. Zorian just gave her a wicked smile. Break. Of course, there was absolutely no chance for Zorian to master all 15 exercises in this particular restart, but that was beside the point. Thanks to the wonder of the time loop, he had far more than a few measly weeks to learn the contents of the book. It was even available in the Academy library, so he didn't have to go to Ilsa in the next restart to acquire it. And who knew, maybe if he learned those he could get Svim to cut him some slack too. A man could dream. Besides, the book was actually fairly interesting. Not only did it explain how to perform each variation in great detail, it also explained the reasons for including each particular exercise, as well as providing a background for understanding why the basic 3 were being taught to students in the first place. Zorian briefly familiarized himself with each of the variations before starting to read earnestly from the start. Making an object glow, levitating it, or setting it aflame, these were very simple effects, requiring only rudimentary shaping skills. The levitation exercise, for instance, was just repelling force emanating from the mage's palm. It doesn't get much simpler than that. There were actually a lot of these simple effects, certainly more than the 3 they were taught, but these 3 were deemed a priority. Production of light, heat, or kinetic force were common components of many spells, giving the basic 3 the sort of general usefulness that most other simple exercises lacked. The variations listed in the book were not in the same category as these simple, or starter exercises. Although Svim, Ilsa, and the book itself referred to them as variations, Zorian realized they were more like upgrades, or perhaps advanced versions. He hadn't realized it at the time, but the pen spinning exercise, which was the very first variation outlined in the book, albeit under a fancier name, was a whole other category of difficulty from simply levitating the pen above his palm. Not only did he have to maintain the levitation effect on the pen, he also had to shape an additional effect to make the pen spin. The variation was supposed to teach mages how to multitask, by making them maintain 2 effects at once. Though Svim would have disagreed, Zorian considered his pen spinning exercise mastered, and the guidelines in the book seemed to agree with him. As such, he started poring over the other 4 variations of the levitation exercise, trying to figure out which one was the easiest. He quickly realized they were not only arranged in an ascending order of difficulty, but that mastering the later variations probably requires mastering the preceding ones first. Vertical levitation required him to make an object stick to his palm with attractive force, position his palm vertically and then make the object separate from his palm without falling down. The sticking part was easy, and something Zorian could already do, but making the object float off the palm without falling required that he balances the attractive force binding the object to his palm and the repelling force that made it separate from it. Without the ability to multitask he acquired from the pen spinning exercise, it probably would have taken forever to master this one. Next was fixed position levitation, which required an ability to maintain the levitated object's position in space despite disruptions and changes in initial conditions. In other words, he had to be able to move his hand up and down, left and right, while keeping the levitated object static in space. It required the ability to balance attractive and repelling force he presumably acquired from the vertical levitation exercise, but this time he had to continually adjust the balance in response to changes. And so on. Seeing how there was only one correct order in which these exercises could be learned, Zorian started practicing vertical levitation. Unfortunately, he wouldn't accomplish much in this particular restart. The summer festival was approaching.